the Thren Dominion did not raise its children, it machined them. On the ringworld of Cassalor, where the artificial sun was a contained fusion ribbon, 11,000 kilometers long, and the gravity had been tuned to the third decimal, every juvenile of the Veil was logged at hatching, scored at the second molt, and sorted by a council of geneticists who had not been wrong, by their own records in 400 years. The Dominion measured worth the way a foundry measured ore, by purity and by yield, and it discarded what failed the assay with the same unhurried efficiency it used to recycle a cracked hull plate. There was no cruelty in it. There was only the grading. And the grading was absolute. And the grading had never once been asked to account for the thing it could not measure. The Veil were a luminous people, tall and silver-skinned, their bioluminescent vascular lines threaded under translucent flesh like cooling rivers of light, and they had built an empire across 40 systems on the strength of a single conviction. A flawed unit weakened the whole. They had carried that conviction so long that they had forgotten it was a choice, and a conviction that forgets it was ever a choice has stopped being a belief and become a wall. The wall was everywhere on Cassalor. It was in the registry spires where juvenile scores were posted in luminous columns that every passing adult could read at a glance. In the assay halls where geneticists pressed their long fingers to a hatchling's vascular lines and pronounced a number that would follow the creature for the rest of its existence. In the disposal manifests that scrolled through the regional authority offices with the dull regularity of a tide, the Dominion did not think of itself as harsh. It thought of itself as honest. It had simply decided 4 centuries deep that a thing's value was the sum of what could be measured about it, and it had built instruments precise enough to measure almost everything, and it had concluded from the precision of its instruments that there was nothing left worth measuring that they could not reach. This was the Empire's great strength. It was also, though no Veil alive would have phrased it so, the single seam along which the whole edifice could one day be made to come apart. Into this system, 4 years before the night the defense grid failed, came a transport carrying salvage from a quarantined human colony the Dominion had annexed and emptied. Most of the salvage was scrap, broken habitat plating, and dead reactors and the cold detritus of a species the Veil regarded as structurally injurious. One item was not scrap. It was a human child, perhaps 6 standard years old, found alive in the wreck of an orbital habitat the survey crews had logged as dead, and it had survived 11 days alone in vacuum-adjacent cold. By rerouting a dying life support node with a length of copper braid and the casing of a ration heater, the child had stripped the braid with its teeth. It had bridged a failed regulator with a contact it had bent into shape against a bulkhead seam. It had kept itself breathing in a box the size of a supply locker while the temperature outside that box fell past the point where Veil tissue would have crystallized. And it had done all of this without instruction, without tools the Dominion would have recognized as tools, and without, so far as the survey record could determine, panicking even once. The survey officer who logged the find did not record any of that. He recorded the medical scan, which showed a malformation of the left auditory structure, a partial deafness, and a neural architecture the Dominion's classification engine could not parse. The engine was a magnificent thing, the accumulated grading wisdom of 400 years rendered into a system that could assess any biological input and return a worth score in under a second. It assessed the child. It found an ear that did not work and a brain that did not match any template in its archive. And it did what it had been built to do with inputs it could not categorize. It returned the designation it reserved for the unparsable. Defective. Recommend disposal. The file was forwarded, as all such files were, to the regional authority that held disposal jurisdiction over annexed biological assets, and the regional authority was a single Veil named Mesa Iolan. Mesa Iolan was not, by any measure the Dominion respected, a sentimental creature. She held the rank of sublumen, which in the Threni hierarchy meant she answered to the planetary council and to no one. Beneath it and her particular portfolio was the integrity of Cassalor's defensive perimeter, the lattice of orbital interdiction platforms, and ground-based resonance arrays that made the Ringworld the single most heavily fortified position in the Dominion. She had held the post for 90 years. She had never lost a platform, never failed an inspection, never once been observed to hesitate. Her vascular light ran cool, and even the mark of a Veil who had mastered the involuntary luminance that betrayed lesser members of her species, and her subordinates had a private name for her that they were careful never to speak in her presence. The Still One. She was not cold in the loud sense, not given to threats or displays, or the bright punitive flares some senior officers used to keep their juniors in line. She was cold in the way deep water is cold, by depth and by pressure, and a junior who displeased her did not receive a reprimand so much as a silence, a long even regard from a face that gave back nothing, after which the junior would find their requisitions reviewed with a thoroughness that taught the lesson better than any flair. She read the disposal file on the human child the way she read every file that crossed her desk, which was completely and once. She did not approve the disposal. She did not at first do anything at all. She requested the raw survey telemetry, the unprocessed sensor logs the disposal recommendation had been built on, and she read those too, line by line, through the first hour and the second. And somewhere in the third hour she found the 11 days. The classification engine had compressed the rerouting into a single flagged anomaly and discarded it as noise, because noise was what the engine called any pattern it could not fit to a template. Mesa did not discard it. She pulled the raw life support logs and reconstructed, from the timestamps of failure and recovery, exactly what the child had done in the dark. She saw the regulator fail. She saw it come back online 90 seconds later, jury-rigged, drawing power through a path no engineer had designed. She saw it fail again and come back again, and again, 11 days of a small organism refusing to let a machine die because the machine dying meant the organism dying too. She understood, in a way the engine never could, that a 6-year-old creature with a malformed ear and an unparsable brain had looked at a dying machine in the dark and had not waited, had reached into the failure and reorganized it, and had done so with materials a Vale engineer would not have recognized as components. The Dominion's grading measured what a unit was. It had no instrument for what a unit did under pressure when no one was grading it. Maesa Iolan had spent 90 years protecting a perimeter, and she knew, with a certainty older than any council, the difference between a specification and a survivor. She filed an override. The form she used had not been invoked on Cassalor in 200 years, and the council clerk who processed it had to consult an archive to confirm it still existed. Custodial adoption of an annexed biological asset by a ranking Dominion officer. It was legal. It was almost never done, because no officer of standing would burden their record with a defective, and because the Dominion's culture regarded the keeping of a graded-out unit as a kind of admission, a confession that one's own judgment had diverged from the council's. Maesa knew exactly what the filing would cost her in the cool calculus of Vale. Standing, and she filed it anyway, and she did not explain herself to anyone, because she had never in 90 years explained herself to anyone, and she saw no reason to begin. The clerk who processed the form looked at her once across the counter, the kind of look that wanted to ask question, and Maesa held the look without expression until the question went back down where it had come from, and the form was stamped. The child's name, the survey log noted in a field no one had bothered to populate correctly, was Ren. Maesa kept it. She did not give the child a Vale designation, did not enter it into the juvenile registry, did not pretend it was something it was not. She simply took it into her household, a spare austere set of rooms high in the administrative spire overlooking the northern array, and she watched. She was very good at watching. It was in the end her entire profession. The first months were a study in mutual incomprehension. Maesa did not know how to feed a human, and the Dominion's dietary archive on the species was thin and largely wrong, and she worked through it the way she worked through everything, by observation and correction, noting what the child ate and what it pushed away and building, privately, a better archive than the one the Empire had. Ren did not know how to be safe. The child flinched at the bright flare of Maesa's light when it ran high, slept in the smallest corner of the smallest room, hoarded fragments of metal and wire under the sleeping pallet in a careful hidden cache, the instinct of a creature that had learned in vacuum. Cold that the difference between living and dying was whether you had the rights, claps, machine broke. Mesa found the cache during a routine cleaning. She did not remove it. She added to it. The next morning there was a length of copper braid and a spare regulator contact placed neatly beside the child's hoard, and Ren looked at them for a long time, and then looked at Mesa, and the two of them never spoke of it, and the cache stayed. What Mesa watched over the following 4 years was a small human learning to hear a world it had been told it could not. Ren's deafness was real, a structural deficit in the left ear that no Vale surgeon would deign to correct on a defective, and Maesa did not correct it either, because she had begun to understand that Ren did not experience it as a deficit. The child compensated by reading vibration. Ren pressed small hands flat against bulkheads and felt the building talk. The spire had a pulse, a deep, slow rhythm in its power conduits, a higher flutter in its ventilation, and Ren learned all of it the way a Vale juvenile learned to read luminance, as a first language. The child knew which corridor carried the heavy current and which ran light. The child knew when the Eastern Stairs junction box drew more than it should, because the box sang at a pitch that meant strain, a pitch only a creature listening through its hands and its bones could ever have caught. At 7, Ren told Maesa, in the careful signed and spoken hybrid the two of them had built between them across 4 years of patient need, that the box was sick. Mesa sent an engineer. The engineer found a degraded relay 40 hours from failure, logged it as a routine catch, and never knew a 7-year-old human with a malformed ear had heard it through a wall. Maesa knew. Maesa logged it too, privately, in a record she kept and showed no one, and she added it to the 11 days, and she began, without ever once saying so, to build a different kind of file on the child the Dominion had told her to throw away. The file was not sentimental. Maesa Iolan did not have a sentimental instrument anywhere in her. The file was an assessment, rigorous and ongoing, of a capability the Empire's grading engine had been structurally unable to perceive, and the more entries it accumulated, the more clearly it said a single thing. The engine had not made an error of degree. It had made an error of kind. It had measured the child against the only axis it possessed and found the child wanting, and it had never once considered that there might be an axis it did not possess, along which the child was not defective at all but was instead the single most valuable instrument on the planet. The Dominion, of course, did not approve. The Council did not move against Mesa directly, because her record was spotless and her perimeter unbreached and the veil respected, results above all else, but the disapproval expressed itself the way institutional disapproval always does, through the slow withdrawal of the benefit of the doubt. Her requisitions were questioned. Her inspection schedule was tightened. A delegation arrived twice a cycle now where once it had arrived once a year, and a junior counselor named Arafat VSS, a luminous creature whose vascular display ran perpetually bright with the eagerness of the ambitious, took it upon himself to make Mesa's defective child a quiet project of his own. Arafat did not hate the child. Arafat was incapable of hatred, which would have required him to regard the child as significant. He regarded the child as an opportunity, a flaw in the still one's otherwise unassailable standing, a seam he could work until the whole garment came apart and left a sublumin's chair vacant for a deserving climber. Arafat VS was, in the Dominion's own grammar, a high-scoring unit. His vascular lines ran bright and symmetrical. His assay had placed him in the top fraction of his molt, and he had risen through the Council's junior ranks on the strength of a mind that was genuinely quick and an ambition that was genuinely bottomless. He understood the Empire's faith in measurement better than almost anyone, because he had spent his whole life being measured and winning, and because he understood that faith so well, he understood, as few did, exactly where it was blind. The Dominion trusted its instruments. The Dominion's instruments flagged what exceeded tolerance. Anything kept beneath tolerance was, to the Dominion, invisible, and a veil clever enough to work beneath tolerance could do almost anything in plain sight of the most heavily instrumented position in the Empire and never trip a single alarm. Arafat had been turning this insight over for some time, looking for the use of it, when Maesa Iolan's defective child handed him a reason to act, by becoming the lever that could pry her loose. This was the situation, stable and quiet and cold. On the night the defense grid failed, it did not fail all at once. Cassilor's defensive lattice was a triumph of redundancy, 300 orbital platforms and 90 ground arrays, woven into a single resonance. Field that could not, by design, suffer a single point of failure. It had no single point of failure. What it had that night was a cascade, and a cascade is a different animal entirely. A single point of failure is a thing you can guard. A cascade is a relationship between things, each of them healthy, each of them behaving exactly as designed, failing together only because of how they were tuned to lean on one another, and you cannot guard a relationship the way you guard a point, because there is nothing there to stand in front of. At 41 minutes past the third bell, an orbital platform in the northern arc reported a phase drift in its resonance coupling, a small thing, well within tolerance, the kind of reading an array logged and corrected 1,000 times a cycle. The platform corrected it. The correction propagated to its two nearest neighbors, as the lattice was designed to do, distributing load so that no single platform ever bore a strain alone. Both neighbors were already carrying a phase drift of their own, identical, well within tolerance. The combined correction was no longer within tolerance. It was 40 meters of arc out of true, and 40 meters of arc, multiplied across a resonance field 11,000 kilometers wide, became a standing wave, and the standing wave began, with the patient inevitability of physics, to feed itself. By the 50th minute, the northern arc was dark. By the third bell after that, 90 platforms had dropped offline in a spreading bloom of cascading correction, each one shutting down exactly as its safety protocol demanded, each shutdown handing its load to neighbors that could not bear it. and the most heavily fortified position in the Dominion was peeling open like a fruit. The council convened an emergency session in the great luminous chamber at the spire's crown. Maesa Yolan, who had never lost a platform, stood at the central display and watched 90 of them die, and her vascular light, for the first time in the memory of anyone present, did not run cool and even. It guttered. The engineers could not find the fault. They were good engineers, the best the assay halls had ever produced, and they threw everything the Empire had at the problem, and the problem laughed at them, because the fault was not in any platform. The fault was in the relationship between them. It was in the resonance coupling itself, in a phase drift signature that should not have been able to synchronize across independent systems, and that meant either an impossible coincidence or a deliberate tuning, and no one in that chamber could find where the tuning had been introduced or how to untune it before the cascade reached the planetary arrays and left Casselor, the jewel of 40 systems, naked to whatever might be watching from the dark. The chief engineer, a long gray veil whose light had gone nearly white with strain, reported that the cascade was self-reinforcing, and that current models gave the planetary arrays somewhat under 1 bell before they would be carrying a load they had not been built to carry alone. The council's luminance flickered through the chamber like wind across a field of lamps, and in the middle of that flickering fear, one veil stood with his light running steady and bright, and that steadiness was the first wrong pixel in the frame, though no one in the chamber was positioned to see it. Arafat VASS was not afraid. A creature watching its empire's defenses fail should have been afraid. Arafat was calm because Arafat knew the failure was not failure but performance, a curtain rising on the act in which he had cast himself as the hero, and he was waiting with the patience of the genuinely clever for the brink at which he would step forward and produce the solution he had spent 3 months preparing in secret. He had only one problem. The cascade was building faster than his model had predicted, and his window to intervene at the perfect dramatic moment was closing, and a creature whose whole plan depends on timing does not handle the loss of timing well. Ren was 10 years old that night, and Ren was not in the council chamber, because defectives were not permitted in council chambers, and Ren was in the administrative spire, with both small hands pressed flat against the cold wall of the eastern stair, listening to Casselor scream. The child had felt it before the first platform reported it. The spire's pulse had changed an hour earlier, a wrongness threaded into the deep, slow rhythm of the power conduits, a beat that did not belong, faint and patient and growing. Ren had no word for resonance coupling. Ren had no clearance, no schematic, no understanding of the lattice as the engineers understood it. What Ren had was 4 years of pressing hands against walls, and learning the difference between a building that was well and a building that was sick, and Casselor was sick. Sick in a way the child had heard once before, 11 days alone in the dark, when a dying machine had hummed a note that meant it was about to stop. The note had a shape. The child knew the shape. It was the shape a thing made just before it quit, and the whole world was making it now, low and growing, threaded through every wall the child touched. Ren went looking for Maesa, found the household empty, the shared rooms dark, the kitchen cold, and did the only thing a 10-year-old human with no clearance could do. Ren followed the wrongness. The wrongness led down. It led through the eastern stair and into the maintenance levels, and down again past junction boxes the child knew by name and by song, into the deep service galleries that ran beneath the northern array where the resonance couplings themselves lived, vast humming pillars of containment that no juvenile and few adults were ever permitted to see. The galleries should have been sealed behind a clearance gate that read luminance signatures and admitted only the council and the senior engineering staff. They were not sealed. A single access hatch stood open on a maintenance override, and the override had been logged under a counselor's clearance 3 hours before the cascade began, and the counselor's name was Arafat VSS, who had needed the galleries open so that he could descend at the brink and be discovered heroically resolving the crisis he had built. The log meant nothing to Ren, who could not read it and would not have understood it. The open hatch meant only that the path the wrongness pulled along was for once not blocked. What Ren understood was the note. Standing in the gallery, both hands flat against the nearest coupling pillar, the child felt the wrongness resolve into something specific. The pillars were not all singing the same song. Most of them ran the deep, even rhythm Ren knew as health, the sound of a thing doing exactly what it was for. Yet scattered among them, 1 in every dozen, ran a fractional flutter, a phase drift so small that no instrument tuned to flag tolerance violations would ever catch a single one of them. And the flutters were not random. They beat together. The child felt it through both palms at once, the way one feels 2 voices fall into unison in a dark room, the lying pillars all humming the same small wrong note in the same slow time, waiting, building, a chorus tune to come due all at once. Someone had walked this gallery and adjusted one coupling in every dozen by an amount too small to alarm any safety system, and the adjustments had been tuned to synchronize so that, when the cascade finally tripped, it would look exactly like an impossible coincidence and not at all like a thing that had been built by hand. Ren did not know the word sabotage. Ren knew that the building had been made sick on purpose, the way a child knows a thing in the body before the mind can name it. And Ren knew which pillars were lying, because Ren could hear them. 3 levels above, in the council chamber, the cascade reached platform 110, and the planetary arrays began, for the first time in 400 years, to register a load they had never been designed to carry alone, and the chief engineer's light went from white to a flat dead gray that every veil in the chamber understood without a word. Mesa Island left the chamber. She did not announce it, did not request permission, simply turned from the central display in the middle of the chief engineer's report and walked out, and the council was too consumed by the failing lattice to mark the still one's departure. Some instinct 90 years deep had told her that the answer was not in this room full of Vael who could measure everything and hear nothing, and beneath that instinct ran a colder thread, which was that her household was empty and her child was missing, and a building that had been made to fail, and a child who could hear buildings had collided in her mind into a single certainty she did not pause to examine. She moved through the spire faster than dignity permitted. She found the open hatch by the override log, read the clearance signature on it in a single glance, filed the name Arafat VSS away in the part of her that never forgot anything, and descended into the galleries, with her vascular light running bright and ungoverned, the still one no longer still. She found Rens standing among the humming pillars with both hands flat against a coupling and an expression on the small human face that Maesa had learned over 4 years to read better than she had ever read any Vael. Concentration, not fear. The child was working. Ren turned, felt the vibration of Maesa's approach through the floor before seeing her, and signed 3 words in the hybrid language the two of them had built. These ones lie. The child took Musa's long silver hand and placed it flat against the nearest pillar, against the deep even note of a healthy coupling, and held it there until Maesa understood the baseline, and then drew the hand 12 pillars down to one that fluttered, and pressed it there and waited. Maesa Island, who had protected this perimeter for 90 years, and had never once been able to feel it, felt for the first time in her life the difference between a coupling that was well and a coupling that had been made to lie. It was so small, beneath any threshold she had ever been trained to watch for, beneath the resolution of every instrument the assay halls had ever built, a flutter she could only catch now because a child's hands were teaching her where to put her own. It was so deliberate, it was. She understood in a single vertiginous instant, the thing the entire Dominion was built to be unable to perceive, a flaw introduced beneath the threshold of every instrument calibrated to detect flaws, by someone who had counted on the Empire's faith in its own measurements. The classification engine could not parse it. The safety protocols could not flag it. Only a creature that read the world through vibration, that had spent its whole short life compensating for an ear that did not work, that had never been allowed to trust an instrument because the instruments had all called it defective, could have heard a building lie. The engine had thrown this child away for the precise quality that was now the only thing standing between Cassalor and the dark. Mesa did not waste time on the vertigo. She was above all an officer. The cascade was minutes from the planetary arrays. She could not stop it from the chamber, and the engineers could not find it at all. But here, in the galleries, with a child who could point to every lying pillar, she had something the entire Dominion lacked. She had the location of the fault. The couplings could be manually decoupled, isolated from the resonance field, taken out of the lattice so the standing wave had nothing left to feed on, but only the corrupted ones, because decoupling a healthy pillar would punch a hole in the perimeter as surely as the cascade itself. Decouple the wrong ones and Cassalor fell. Decouple the right ones and the wave starved. There were 300 couplings in the northern galleries. Ren knew which dozens and some were lying. No one else on Cassalor did. They worked. Maesa carried the override authority in the long reach and the knowledge of the decoupling sequence, the precise order in which a coupling had to be drawn down so its load shed safely into the field instead of slamming into its neighbors and seeding. A fresh cascade of her own making. A decoupling done wrong was indistinguishable from the sabotage itself. She knew the sequence the way she knew her own vascular lines, 90 years of it written into her hands. Ren carried the only sense organ on the planet that could find the targets. The child went pillar to pillar with both hands flat against the containment housings, head tilted, the malformed left ear pressed close to the cold metal, and at each one signed a single word. True, 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 lie. Teysa decoupled the liars in the sequence her 90 years dictated, her hands moving across the control housings with a precision the Dominion had always praised and never understood, drawing each corrupted pillar down through its safe shutdown curve, while Ren moved ahead to find the next. It was slow and it could not be hurried. Each decoupling took the better part of a minute to shed its load safely, and there were 14 lying pillars. And the standing wave did not pause politely to wait for them. Twice the cascade jumped ahead of their progress, and a platform far overhead went dark, and twice Mesa felt the load shift through the gallery floor and recalculated her sequence without breaking the rhythm of her hands. Behind them, the standing wave, deprived one pillar at a time of the synchronized couplings that had been feeding it, began to lose coherence. It did not stop at once. Physics does not forgive at once. Even so, the bloom of darkness spreading across the lattice slowed and steadied, and as the 14th lying pillar drew down through the last of its shutdown curve, the standing wave came apart into ordinary noise that the healthy couplings absorbed without complaint. 41 minutes after Maesa Yolin walked out of the council chamber, the planetary arrays registered their load falling back within tolerance and held. The grid did not fall, Casalor did not open to the dark, and in the council chamber the chief engineer reported, with the bewildered relief of a Vale who did not understand his own good news, that the cascade had inexplicably arrested itself, and the council exhaled its luminous relief in a wave that ran the length of the great chamber. Exactly one Vale in that chamber did not exhale, because exactly one Vale had built the cascade and knew with absolute certainty that it could not arrest itself, which meant someone had found the couplings, which meant the impossible coincidence had a witness, and a scheme built to be invisible does not survive a witness who can point. Arafat VSS had not in fact intended to bring down Casalor. That was the part the council never fully grasped afterward, because it did not fit their grammar of villainy, which had only two settings, the loyal unit and the broken one. Arafat had intended a controlled failure, a near miss, a cascade that would reach the brink and require heroic intervention he had positioned himself to provide, having spent 3 months quietly studying the coupling tunings precisely, so that he could be the one to find them when the moment came. He had meant to be the savior of Casalor, to descend through the override hatch at the brink and produce the solution and ascend on the strength of it, and the sublumin chair he coveted, Mesa Eolin's chair, would have followed within the cycle, vacated by an officer whose perimeter had nearly failed on her watch. He had not counted on the cascade building faster than his model predicted. He had not counted on losing his own window to intervene while he stood paralyzed in the council chamber, watching his careful timing dissolve, and he had not, in his most careful planning, counted on a defective human child hearing the lie 3 levels down and a disgraced officer walking out of the chamber to follow her, because those were inputs his model could not parse, the same way the classification engine could not parse the child 4 years before. Arafat had built his entire scheme on the Dominion's faith in its own measurements, and the only 2 beings on Casalor who had ever been taught to distrust those measurements had walked into his galleries and undone him. The investigation took 11 days, which Mesa noted privately was a number with weight. She did not give the council the child. She gave them the fault. She walked into the next session with the decoupling logs and the manual record of 14 corrupted pillars and let the engineers draw their own conclusions about a phase drift that had been tuned beneath tolerance by a hand that knew exactly where the Empire's best instruments stopped looking. The override log under Arafat's clearance was the first thread, the open hatch that should have been sealed, logged 3 hours before a cascade that the logger could not have predicted unless he had built it. The coupling tunings, once the engineers knew to look for them, told the rest, because the engineers were good at their work when they were finally pointed at the right wall. The council, confronted with the seam in their own faith, did what institutions do when their blindness is made visible. They closed ranks around the proof and looked no harder than they had to at the question of how the proof had been found. Arafat VSS was stripped of his luminance privileges and remanded to the council's custody before the second bell of the 12th day. The council did not show Maesa Yolin the moment of his fall, and she did not ask to see it, because she had learned long ago that the satisfaction of watching an enemy break is a luxury the disciplined do not require. She had the perimeter. She had held it. That was the only verdict she had ever needed. The council, in the careful aftermath, restored her tightened inspection schedule to its old cadence and quietly stopped questioning her requisitions, and not one councillor ever said aloud that the most heavily fortified position in the Dominion had been saved by a unit the Dominion had ordered destroyed. because to say it aloud would have been to admit that the grading could be wrong, and the grading could not be wrong, and so the saving of Cassalor entered the record as an anomaly resolved by subluminiolan, full stop, and the child's name appeared nowhere in it. What Maesa did not have in the cold aftermath was any clear sense of what to do with the thing that had happened between her and the child in the galleries. Maesa Iolan had taken Ren in as an override, a private correction of an institutional error, an act of judgment she had justified to herself in the language of assessment. The child has value the engine cannot measure. She had told herself, for 4 years, that this was a matter of accuracy, that she had simply graded the unit correctly where the Dominion had graded it wrong, and she had built her private file and kept her private records, and never once allowed the matter to become anything warmer than a correction. The galleries had broken that. Standing among the lying pillars with the child's small hand guiding hers, feeling for the first time in her life a truth her whole civilization was deaf to, Maesa had felt something she had no file for, something the Dominion had no instrument to measure and no grammar to name, and she had spent 90 years governing the involuntary luminance that betrayed lesser Vael precisely so that she would never have to feel a thing she could not name. She did not name it now. She was not built to. What she did, 3 days after the investigation closed, was smaller than naming and larger than anything she had ever done. The Vael drank a heated mineral infusion called Sevret, taken from a shared vessel, and the sharing of Sevret was among them the oldest and quietest signal of kinship, a thing done within a household or a bonded unit, and never ever offered to an unbonded outsider, least of all an annexed asset of another species. Maesa had never once offered Ren the vessel. She had prepared the child's food separately for 4 years with care, but separately, maintaining without ever articulating it the boundary the Dominion required, the line between an officer and the defective in her custody. The separate preparation had been, she understood now, the last wall, the final place where she had let the grading stand between them, and she had kept it standing because as long as it stood, she could tell herself the child was a correction and not a thing she could not name. On the 3rd evening after the close, Maesa heated the Sevret in the spare austere kitchen of the Spire household, and she filled the shared vessel, and she drank, and then she did not set the vessel down and prepare a separate cup for the child. She held the vessel out across the table, the warm vessel, the kinship vessel, and she waited. Ren was 10, and Ren had spent a life learning to read what people did instead of what they said, because the saying had never been reliable. The child looked at the vessel. The child looked at Maesa, at the silver face that had never once in 4 years been anything but composed, and saw the vascular light beneath it running not cool and even, the way the still one's light had always run, but warm, uneven, ungoverned, betraying, the way Maesa had spent 90 years ensuring it would never run where anyone could see. Ren did not sign anything. Ren did not speak. The child reached across the table and took the vessel in both small hands, the hands that read walls, the hands that had found the lie 3 levels down, and drank, and set the vessel down in the center of the table where either of them could reach it, and left it there. Maesa Iolen looked at the shared vessel sitting in the middle of the table, within easy reach of a human child the Dominion had ordered her to throw away, and she did not reach for it again right away, and she did not need to, because it was already where it belonged. Her light ran warm. She let it. For the first time in 90 years the still one did not govern the thing she could not name, and the spire was quiet around them, and far below in the northern galleries the couplings ran their deep even note, all of them true now, every one of them telling the truth, holding the perimeter she had spent her life protecting, holding it for reasons she had finally stopped trying to grade.